Disclaimer, I am not from the US. I understand that they are, quote, choosing to believe China regarding its whole socialism with Chinese characteristics. Who is they? Are you talking about PSL? Which is likely to just be revisionism. I mean, yeah, I covered that in the Why Not PSL video like a year ago at the last election, which is, I read an article from Brian Becker. Like, he knows it's revisionist. So, I mean, it's not even that they're choosing to believe China. If you read the article, he says flat out that it's like, it has like turned its back on the working class and all this other stuff. Don't quote me on that. Look up the video because I read the article out. But no, like they recognize it's revisionist, but then they just call it socialism anyway. Don't do that. Anyway, isn't PSL better than the other parties in the U.S. that are outright social democrats? DSA is not a party. DSA is an umbrella group that to me seems like, aside from like a focused communist group, is the sort of, like the Green Party. DSA was founded decades ago, but for a long time it was really, really small. The Green Party for a while, like when I was getting involved in this in the 2000s, the Green Party was bigger because of the Ralph Nader campaign. And so if there was left activity, a lot of times it would be around the Green Party. Now, it does seem like, I think especially under Jill Stein, that has fallen way off. There's a number of reasons for that. Obama drained a lot of progressive energy off, and, David Cobb was not the most inspiring candidate either in the mid-2000s. And then Jill Stein, I really dislike. I think the Green Party could do, even the Green Party could do better than Jill Stein, in my opinion. There are eco-socialists in the Green Party, though, in the left wing, and I definitely do support that, and, am friendly with a number of eco-socialists in the Green Party. But, yeah, it seems like DSA is definitely more where the action is at this point as far as general activism. The problem is all the opportunism toward the Democratic Party, from the center and right wing of DSA. But there's a lot of people talking about DSA that have no idea what they're talking about, and I see this in the comments. It'll be a sweeping, very dogmatic take on DSA, even if you have criticisms of DSA, which I have. First DSA meeting I went to back in 2016, it was way too lib for me. I mean, way too liberal. And I wasn't even a communist at that point. I was like more of like an ANCOM. And I really didn't like the conversation there. That said, they were... ended up running campaigns on various issues, and some of those were useful. I thought the overall level of class consciousness was pretty low. So yeah, I think the DSA has eclipsed the Green Party and is more sort of multi-purpose. Also, U.S. elections are really not conducive to a left party. This is another thing that came up in the recent Hassan response video, is people like, well, we have to run in the Democrats to win elections. Winning elections is not the point. That's not the point. Organizing is the point. And if you're organizing within the Democratic Party, you don't own your organization. Okay? Now, I know that's going to blow up a lot of people's brains. What do you mean winning elections isn't the point? Well, there's a thing from 1850. If you want to understand the Marxist perspective, 1850, we have it on the channel. Look up Marx on Guns, or Under No Pretext, because it's where the Under No Pretext quote comes from. Marx, 1850, address to the Communist League. And basically what was happening at that time, and you might not appreciate this perspective properly if you haven't done a lot of study in 2025, but once upon a time, capitalism was not set in stone. So the 1848 revolutions, like in Germany, were the capitalists setting up a capitalist government for the first time that didn't exist previously. They were getting rid of the remnants of feudalism and setting up a new capitalist government. What Marx said was, fuck that noise, basically. Do your own thing. Set up a parallel, so the capitalists are going to set up their government because there's a power vacuum. Feudalism is collapsing, right? So he's like, what you should do as the Workers' Party is just do your own thing, set up a parallel government, like in Russia, the Soviets, like workers' councils, councils of soldiers and workers and whoever else is in your coalition there, and set up a parallel government that will disregard and sabotage the capitalist government. and then try to outpace them. And if you have a clear shot, and you can gain legitimacy over their embryonic capitalist government, overtake them, and crush their government. So that's a lot easier to do when it's still newborn, But, and while the messaging unfortunately didn't really spread in time, arguably, for like Germany, that statement was made in 1850. Russia wasn't at that point until the early 1900s, like 50 years later. So they did have time to do all that, because it was the 1905 revolution where the capitalists were really starting to get traction. That parliament was set up for the first time at that point. So the workers were trying to get in on that, and they had their own independent organization, which was very combative towards the capitalists. They would let the capitalists do certain tasks in the struggle, because there's bourgeois democratic tasks and there's, socialist tasks. They would let them do some of it, but they always maintained, and this is, I think, the genius of Lenin applying this, if you read through Lenin's stuff in this time period, was, a lot of the Mensheviks were like, the best we can do right now is let the capitalists set up the government and then try to get elected to the capitalist government. Lenin was like, no, that's not a Marxist position. What we need to do is keep separate from them, set up our parallel organizations, and then when the time is right, we try to overtake them. And that's exactly what they did in 1917. There was a power vacuum because the Tsar was deposed in February of that year. The capitalists started setting up their provisional government that summer, and then in the fall, there was the socialist revolution, and this was all with the backdrop of World War I. So there was a lot of chaos and a lot of change. Now, the problem that we've had, which we may not be having in the relatively, next 2 decades, is it's pretty hard, much easier to take something down when it's still embryonic, before the world is convinced that it's just here to stay, which is unfortunately the case with, a lot of the governments of the imperialist countries. People have trouble imagining a world without the French government or the, well, I would say the German government. Germany was split in half for a long time, not so long ago. Or the Belgian government or the Spanish government or whatever. They have a hard time imagining that not existing the way that it is. But as capitalism goes into decay and crisis, what I saw, I think 2008 was a shot across the bow of what the 21st century is going to be like in the imperialist countries. It was the reemergence of crisis on a scale that, at least the dominant narrative was, that's in the past. Capitalism is stable now. It's the end of history. It's here for all time. 2008 just showed that is not the case at all. There are systemic problems that you had 20 banks, now you have 4 banks. And, we're at the too big to fail stage, where it's like imperialism just merging and merging and merging, where everything is just like one capitalist entity at this point, which is trying to preserve itself at all costs. Now, what we've seen since the pandemic is a level of inflation that we have not seen in the U.S. in a long time. The crisis in the housing market is a good reflection of the level of abnormality. And as we've covered in some of the previous live streams and other current events opinion videos, there are telltale signs. If you look up the yield inversion curve, which is a very reliable recession indicator, going back like 75 years, there has been the biggest, longest yield inversion ever. And the recession part of that still hasn't hit. Like the layoffs haven't hit, the bank failures, the company closures, all that stuff is about to tip right now, finally, because they're out of cash. The liquidity, like I was saying before, has dried up. So what we saw after 2008 was a left-wing movement in the streets, Occupy. And the video that I have pinned on the channel, Bernie Sanders and the Lesson of Occupy Wall Street, is all about that. There was the anti-war movement, anti-Iraq war, and kind of like anti-Bush movement in the 2000s before that. But 2008, people were like, it really caught a lot of people off guard because no one was expecting that. And then, well, you had the Tea Party, which was like an AstroTurf right-wing response to that. And also to try to rebrand the Republican Party after Bush and Cheney, which nobody really talks about the impact of Bush and Cheney. I feel like I'm one of the only people on the planet still talking about Bush and Cheney. That was such a turning point in the Republican Party, in the U.S. government in general. What they ushered in, they created the Department of Homeland Security, all the ICE stuff. All of that was laid under Bush and Cheney. It just wasn't there before. The whole logic of the war on terror, that's what they're still basically operating on, even though they don't talk about the war on terror per se today. And a lot of actually what shifted the conversation away from that topic is the 2008 crash. Is all anybody like the day before that, everybody was still talking about terrorism. You know, you turn on the news like terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. Then Lehman Brothers goes down. That's all anybody talked about for like the next 5 years. And we got Occupy out of that. There was not a general left-wing movement talking about capitalism prior to that. There just wasn't. If this next crash goes down, because we've been in this weird limbo ever since 2008. We've been in economic la-la land. They've been doing stuff to try to keep the economy going at like the highest levels since 2008. It's totally new territory. And they're running out of road. They can't inflate it away because we're already at max inflation. If they do any more, it's like hyperinflation. They also can't let it crack because if they do deflation and prices come down, there could be a debt crisis. So they're at like the end of the road. They're out of tricks at this point. I'm sure they'll come up with something, but most likely there's going to be a gigantic crash. And after 2008, like I said, there was a general left-wing movement that popped up. I expect, and I'm, at this point at least, really kind of waiting to see what happens. I mean, I'm not entirely passively waiting to see. Obviously, we're laying the groundwork and trying to get as many people turned into communists, or at least somewhat familiar with communism as possible. But I think that's going to be just a watershed, game-changing moment after this next crisis. So my point being, when is it easiest to oppose a system? Well, either when it's just setting up and there's still a power vacuum from the old one. Okay, and then probably not when it's at its peak of stability and people are still giving it a chance and seeing how far it goes, and there's still that petty bourgeois aspiration to, like, you know, people still believe capitalism has mileage in it. But what I'm saying is, after 2008, the amount of people who believe capitalism still had mileage in it dropped a good 20-30%. After this next crisis, more and more people are going to go, you know what, I don't think capitalism has, you know, much road left. And they have been pumped full of anti-communist, anti-socialist propaganda for a long time. I think the reality of the economic conditions is going to start making them go, probably like as was the case for a lot of you. I mean, I got pumped full of anti-communist propaganda. At one point, you know, I was a really cringe anti-communist in my life. You know, I mean, that's the default mode that you're raised in the U.S. Across a lot of strata of the U.S. at least. It's rare to be a quote unquote red diaper baby, as they say, like raised by communists. That's super rare because the U.S. suppresses communists. So yeah, it's unusual to run into that. But eventually, you know, I just had so many questions about, like, why are these wars happening and why is this so fucked up? And eventually I found my way over to anti-capitalist stuff, and I was like, oh, this is actually answering my questions. This is making sense. That's going to keep the more the system gives people doubts about its future, the more they're going to start looking at that. We just have to be there to, help process them, so to speak, to help educate them and help get them hooked up with organizations. And, the more work we can do against revisionism now, the better. And to make that clear, because it took me several years. I'm running a channel. I'm doing the reading, and it's still super confusing about, you know, is China really doing? Are they on the road to communism, or are they social imperialist? Are they doing is this like social democracy? What are they doing? Super confusing. We need to clarify these questions, because I'm telling you, there's going to be like decision time coming up real soon. Again, anybody old enough to remember the impact of 2008. I believe there's something 3 or 4 times as big as that on the horizon, and it won't be the last time. One of the things about the AI bubble is they're building on these data centers. So, I mean, there's huge environmental impacts of that. But if AI turns out not to be profitable, I think right now, if I remember the numbers correctly, Meta, Facebook, is building a data center in Louisiana that is supposed to be the size of Manhattan when it's all built. And it's supposed to cost $26 billion to build. That's a lot of money if for something that isn't profitable. And there are major banks, like I believe JP Morgan is lending money on that. That's how you get systemic risk and contagion. And we get into too big to fail territory, except they've already put so much on the Federal Reserve balance sheet. They don't have anywhere to go. Like they've been, what I'm trying to say is they've been bailing out the economy all along. It's quantitative easing. It never stopped. In fact, it's way higher. If you look up the Federal Reserve balance sheet, quantitative easing is higher than ever. They just don't have, they can't go that much higher with it. They will try, but they're risking severe problems at that point. So if the AI bubble pops and, major lenders are caught with their pants down, I can't even tell you what's going to happen then, but it could lead to a serious crack up of credibility of capitalism, where people start going like, look, we need a new system. I don't know what it is, but we need a new system. I think you're going to see a lot of that. And we need to be there then. I know that for a long time, it's felt really futile being a communist in the U.S. I think that could definitely change in upcoming decades. So get started now is the point. Anyway, what were we talking about? DSA and Green Party. Yeah, I mean, revisionist parties versus one of those. Like I said, I haven't seen a huge amount of change in the revisionist parties, whereas DSA, to me, it's so much more loosely controlled and a big tent. I don't think that that's the be-all, end-all, but I see a useful boots-on-the-ground activism coming out of that doesn't have to do with electoral politics. And also there are Marxist caucuses forming within that I think people are networking, and that could give rise to other organizations later on down the line. So I think it's in a transitional state at this point. The U.S. left in general is trying to, we're in a big dialogue now as a political movement of like, what forms is this going to take? What organizations are we going to use? What's the guiding ideology? And, right up on through a revolution, there's still going to be debates about that. But what I see within DSA is some of that happening. And, if somebody really wants to stand a party that I think is revisionist, like, be my guest. The reason that I come out and say that I think something is revisionist is from studying, the history of Marxism-Leninism, because most of these, capitalism doesn't run on real complicated logic, and in a way, neither does the movement to oppose it. Opportunism tries to dress itself up in different forms, but it basically just ends up being the same thing over and over again. It gets easier and easier to spot the more you work on it. So anyway, isn't PSL better than that? I don't know. I mean, do you think it's better to have a party teaching people that China is really socialist? If you do, then support that. If you want a more open-ended thing where people are still kind of figuring out what they think, that to me is more helpful at this point. At some point, people do need to get into a party that has a good, actually Marxist-Leninist line. I think a lot of people are still in a transition, and they're still kind of not sure of what they think yet. Hence, you get a big DSA. That's my take on that. Is it better than a fascist-like party? Yeah, pretty much everything is. In other words, does a mistaken line on China invalidate the rest of good work? I would say yes, it does in large part, because if you're telling people that's socialism and it isn't, that's like telling people Zoran Mamdani is socialist. You know what I mean? It has the same disorienting effect. And like I said, my position is that the Chinese question is kind of the main dominant thing to figure out, the main trend, the main thing to oppose or come to some better, resolution on. And a party that's just sort of not actively taking that on is not a party that meets this moment, in my opinion.